Some truths are buried so deep, you'll wish they stayed hidden. Tonight, we're diving into 3 disturbing tales of manipulation, control, and the shadows lurking beneath. From the dark tunnels of Portland to the quiet whispers of an invisible puppet master, and the truth that was never meant to be revealed, these stories will make you question everything. If you're ready for the unknown, make sure to subscribe, hit the notification bell, and let us know in the comments. If you could change one moment in history, what would it be and why? The others beneath. I've been working maintenance for the city of Portland, Maine for 10 years. Most of the time, it's an easy job. Fixing pipes, dealing with sewage backups, things like that. The sewers aren't glamorous, but they're predictable. Or at least they were. It started 2 weeks ago with the smell. People in the old Port District began complaining about it. Something worse than the usual funk of rotting fish and low tide. This was different, stronger, almost chemical. By the time the complaints reached my department, the smell had spread across half the city. I got the call from my boss, Gary, early in the morning. He told me to grab my gear and meet him at the corner of Middle and Exchange, where the smell was at its worst. When I arrived, Gary was already there, leaning against the city truck, his face twisted in disgust. "Jesus, you smell that?" he asked, waving a hand in front of his nose. I nodded. It was hard not to. The odor was overwhelming, thick in the air like a cloud of invisible smoke. It made my eyes water. "Something's backed up," I said. "Probably a broken line." Gary shook his head. "Already checked. There's nothing on our end. Whatever it is, it's not normal." He handed me a flashlight and pointed to the manhole cover in the middle of the street. "We gotta go down there and check it out." I didn't like the sound of that. The sewers in this part of town were old, some of the oldest in the country. Built in the 1800s, most of the original brickwork was still intact, but it wasn't exactly stable. The city had been putting off repairs for years, and some sections were practically crumbling. Still, it was my job, and I wasn't going to argue with Gary. I lifted the heavy manhole cover and climbed down the iron rungs into the darkness below. The smell hit me first. It was even worse underground, a choking stench of rot and something else. Something metallic, like rusted iron. I clicked on my flashlight and started walking through the narrow tunnel, my boots sloshing through the muck. Gary followed close behind, his own light bobbing as we moved deeper into the system. The walls were slick with moisture, the sound of dripping water echoing around us. But there was something else, too. A low, almost imperceptible hum. It vibrated through the brick, making the air feel heavy. "Do you hear that?" I asked, stopping to listen. Gary frowned, shining his light around the tunnel. "Yeah. What is that?" I shook my head. I didn't know. We kept moving, following the sound as it grew louder. The further we went, the worse the smell got, and soon it was so overpowering I had to pull my shirt up over my mouth just to breathe. We rounded a corner, and that's when we saw it. The water in the tunnel was different. It wasn't the usual dirty brown sludge. It was black, thick, and it was moving. "Jesus Christ," Gary muttered, taking a step back. I crouched down, shining my light on the surface of the water. It wasn't just moving with the current. It was bubbling, like something beneath the surface was trying to break through. "We need to report this," I said, standing up. "Whatever's down here, it's not just a clog." Gary didn't argue. We turned to head back, but the tunnel behind us had changed. The air was colder, the hum louder, and the walls, they didn't look right. The bricks were darker, older, as if we'd somehow stepped into a part of the sewer that hadn't been touched in centuries. "I don't remember this part," Gary said, his voice uneasy. Neither did I. We kept moving faster now, but the further we went, the more twisted the tunnel became. The brickwork was warped, bulging in places, the mortar cracked and crumbling. Something had been down here, something powerful enough to tear through solid stone. Then we heard it, the sound of something moving in the water behind us. I stopped, turning to shine my light back down the tunnel. The black water was rippling, and for a moment, I thought I saw something break the surface. A hand. Pale. Bloated. "Run," I whispered, grabbing Gary's arm. We took off, sprinting through the narrow tunnel, our lights bouncing wildly. The sound of splashing grew louder behind us, like something massive was dragging itself through the water, gaining on us. I didn't dare look back. We reached a junction and I skidded to a stop, breathing hard. Gary bent over, hands on his knees, gasping for air. "What the hell was that?" he wheezed. "I don't know," I said, shining my light back down the tunnel. The water was still now, but the hum, it was deafening. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice shaking. "Now!" Gary didn't argue. We started running again, but the tunnel kept twisting, leading us deeper underground instead of toward the surface. The walls were different now, no longer brick, but stone. Smooth. Carved. "This isn't right," Gary said, panic creeping into his voice. "We shouldn't be this far down." But we were. Somehow the sewer had changed. It wasn't just a system of tunnels anymore. It was something older, something alive. We reached another junction, and that's when we saw it. The thing was massive, its pale, bloated body rising out of the black water like some kind of grotesque sea creature. Its skin was slick, translucent, the veins beneath pulsing with that same rhythmic hum. It had no eyes, just a gaping circular mouth lined with rows of needle-like teeth. And it wasn't alone. Behind it, more figures emerged from the water. Smaller, humanoid shapes. Their skin was pale and bloated, their eyes black and sunken. They moved toward us, silent, their mouths hanging open as if they were gasping for air. "We need to move!" Gary shouted, but my legs wouldn't respond. I was frozen, staring at the thing as it loomed over us, its mouth opening wider, wider. Gary grabbed me, snapping me out of it. We ran, dodging through the maze of tunnels, the sound of those things splashing through the water close behind. I don't know how long we ran, but eventually we found our way back. The tunnel changed again, the stone walls giving way to the familiar brick of the city sewer system. We climbed the rungs, pulling ourselves out of the manhole and into the blinding light of the afternoon sun. We didn't talk about it. We just climbed into the truck and drove. That was 2 weeks ago. Gary quit the next day. I haven't been back down there since, but the smell is still here. And every night when I close my eyes, I hear it. The hum, growing louder, closer. Something's down there, something old, something that shouldn't exist. And I know it's waiting. The Man with the Voice. I've been a detective in Cedar Rapids for nearly 15 years. I've seen my fair share of strange things, cases that don't add up, suspects that vanish without a trace, even a few that left me questioning my own sanity. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for the case of Elliot Pierce. It started on a chilly Friday morning. I was sitting at my desk nursing a cup of coffee when the call came in. A woman, Rebecca Hastings, had barricaded herself in her office at a local law firm. She wasn't answering the phone, and her coworkers said she'd been acting strange for days, talking about how someone was controlling her. When I arrived, the scene was already tense. Her office door was locked from the inside, and her colleagues were standing outside, wide-eyed and anxious. I knocked on the door, trying to calm her down. "Rebecca, this is Detective Jacob Lee. Can you hear me? We're here to help." There was silence for a moment, then a faint voice from the other side. "He's inside my head." My stomach dropped. I motioned for my partner to step back as I leaned closer to the door. "Rebecca, who's inside your head? Who's doing this?" Again, a long pause, then she whispered, "The man with the voice." It took us an hour to coax her out of the office. When she finally opened the door, she looked exhausted, her eyes sunken and hollow. I tried to get her to explain what had happened, but her answers were fragmented, disjointed. She kept insisting that a man she had never met, was speaking to her, telling her what to do, controlling her thoughts. At first, I thought she was having a breakdown. Maybe the pressure of her job had gotten to her, or maybe there was something more serious going on mentally. But when I dug deeper, I found that Rebecca wasn't the first person to say something like this. There had been 3 other cases in the past month, people who claimed they were being controlled by a voice in their heads. All of them described the same thing: a man they couldn't see, whose voice would seep into their minds, making them do things they would never do on their own. 2 of those people were dead. I tracked down one of the survivors, a man named Brian Sims, who had been hospitalized after attempting to walk into traffic. He had survived, but only just. When I spoke to him, he was sitting in a small, sterile hospital room, staring blankly out the window. "Brian," I began, "I'm investigating what happened to you. Can you tell me about the man who spoke to you?" He didn't turn to look at me. His voice was flat, emotionless. "He doesn't speak to me anymore." I waited for a moment, then pressed on. "Who is he?" Brian finally turned to face me. His eyes were wide, haunted. "I don't know." But his voice, it was like he was inside my mind. I couldn't block it out. He told me to step into the street. I didn't want to, but I couldn't stop myself. I felt a chill run down my spine. "Did you ever see him? Did he come to you in person?" Brian shook his head. "No, he doesn't need to. Once he finds you, it's over." The more I investigated, the more I realized that these people weren't connected. They didn't work together, didn't frequent the same places, didn't even live in the same neighborhoods. But they all described the same sensation: the voice, the control, the helplessness. Then, about a week after my conversation with Brian, I got a call that made my blood run cold. It was from a man named Elliot Pierce. I had never heard of him before, but he seemed to know everything about me. "Detective Lee," the voice on the other end of the line said, smooth and confident. "I hear you've been asking about me." I froze. There was something about his tone that sent alarm bells ringing in my head. "Who is this?" I asked, my voice steady, though my heart was racing. "You already know," he replied. "I'm the man with the voice." I didn't know what to say. 1,000 thoughts were racing through my mind. Was this the guy behind everything? Could he really do what they said he could? "You've been causing quite a stir, Detective," Pierce continued, sounding almost amused. "I'm not sure I appreciate that." "What do you want?" I asked, gripping the phone tighter. There was a long silence on the other end, and for a moment, I thought he had hung up. Then he spoke again, his voice softer, more menacing. "I want you to understand how easy it is. How easy it is to control someone's mind, to make them do things they wouldn't normally do, things they can't explain." My pulse quickened. "Is that what you've been doing? To Rebecca? To Brian? To all those people?" "Oh, I didn't have to work very hard with them," he said, his tone light. "You see, some people are more susceptible to suggestion. But you, Detective, I think you're different." My mouth went dry. What's that supposed to mean? Another pause, and then his voice dropped to a whisper. "You'll find out soon enough." The line went dead. After that call, I didn't sleep for days. I was constantly looking over my shoulder, waiting for Pierce to make his move. But nothing happened. For weeks, it was radio silence. I was starting to think maybe it had all been a sick game, that maybe he'd moved on to another victim. But then one night I woke up in the middle of the night gasping for air. It wasn't a dream. His voice, Pierce's voice, was in my head, as clear as if he were standing right beside me. "It's time, Detective," the voice whispered. "Get up." I sat bolt upright in bed, my heart hammering in my chest. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just a bad dream, but the voice persisted. "Go to the window," it commanded. My body moved on its own. I walked to the window, every muscle in my body tense, my mind screaming to stop. But I couldn't. The voice was in control. "Now open the window," I did as I was told, my hands trembling as I pushed the window open, the cold night air hitting my face. "Jump," Pierce's voice whispered, smooth and calm. I stood there, frozen, staring down at the street below. It wasn't a long fall, but it would be enough. "Jump, detective!" I fought against the voice, my mind screaming for control. I felt myself stepping closer to the ledge, my feet moving without my consent. Sweat dripped down my face as I struggled, every ounce of my willpower focused on stopping. Then, just as I was about to step off the ledge, the voice stopped. I collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath, my body shaking. I don't know how long I sat there, but when I finally looked up, I realized something. The phone on my nightstand was ringing. Slowly, I reached for it, my hand still trembling. "Detective Lee," Pierce's voice said on the other end, cool and detached. "You're not as easy as I thought, but don't worry. I'll be seeing you again soon." The line went dead. I never heard from Pierce after that night, but I know he's still out there, waiting, watching. And I know that one day I'll hear his voice again. When I do, I'm not sure I'll be able to fight it a second time. The last word. Some people live their entire lives in the shadows, pulling strings, making decisions that ripple out into the world without anyone ever knowing their names. I used to think those people were just the stuff of conspiracy theories, the paranoia of folks with too much time on their hands. Then I became one of them. My name is Michael Cole, and for the last 15 years I worked for an organization you've never heard of. My job wasn't glamorous. I wasn't some James Bond type. My job was simple. I wrote history. Not in the sense that I documented it, but in the sense that I made sure the right stories were told while the wrong ones vanished. I controlled information. I decided what the public got to know and what would be buried in classified files never to see the light of day. I'd been good at it. Really good. But as I sit here tonight staring out at the skyline of Louisville from this dingy motel room, I know my time's almost up. They'll be coming for me soon. I've seen it happen to the best of us. But before they do, I have to get this story out. My last assignment. It started 6 months ago when I received a directive that was unlike any I'd gotten before. Usually I'm sent after people, journalists sniffing too close to classified material, whistleblowers trying to leak government secrets. But this time it wasn't a person. It was a book. A self-published, barely noticed book that had been written by some nobody living on the outskirts of Louisville. The author, Alan Preston, was an English professor at a local college. A small-time guy, no following to speak of. The book was a collection of essays and short stories, the kind of thing that might have sold a few dozen copies to his students, or ended up in the bargain bin at a used bookstore. Except there was something in that book, something buried between the fiction and rambling essays, that had caught the attention of people much higher up than me. I was sent to Louisville under the guise of a journalist myself, looking to interview Preston about his book for a small literary magazine. My real mission, though, was clear. Find out what Preston knew, how he knew it, and make sure that knowledge disappeared. The first time I met him, he seemed like a regular guy. Mid-50s, balding with a slight hunch in his posture. His office at the college was cramped, filled with piles of papers and dusty old books. He welcomed me in with a tired smile, clearly flattered that anyone was even interested in his work. We made small talk, and I played the part of an enthusiastic writer fascinated by his book. But the more we talked, the more I realized that Preston wasn't just some harmless academic with an overactive imagination. There was something deeper, something darker behind his words. He started talking about power, about control, about how governments don't just rule, they shape reality itself. He spoke in riddles, referencing events that had never made it into the history books, but that I knew were real. Assassinations, black ops missions, coups staged in far-off countries. He knew things he shouldn't have known. At first, I thought he might just be a conspiracy theorist who'd gotten lucky, stumbled onto a few breadcrumbs and pieced them together. But then he said something that made my blood run cold. "You know," he said, leaning back in his chair, "I never really believed it myself. Thought it was all just stories, something to scare the kids with. But after what I found, well, it's hard to ignore the truth, isn't it?" "What truth?" I asked, keeping my voice calm, though my heart was pounding. Preston smiled, a slow, knowing smile. "That everything we know, everything we believe, is a lie. And it's people like you who make sure we stay in the dark." I left his office that day knowing I couldn't take any chances. Preston was dangerous, not in the traditional sense, but because he had tapped into something real. He wasn't supposed to know about the things he did, and that made him a threat. I reported back to my superiors, recommending that the book be pulled, that Preston be dealt with quietly. But the response I got was different than I expected. They didn't want him silenced. They wanted him watched. I spent the next few months shadowing Preston, watching his every move, monitoring his communications. For a while, nothing happened. He went about his life, teaching classes, writing in his office, occasionally working on another book. But then, one night, something changed. I intercepted an email he had sent to a journalist, a real journalist this time, talking about the documents. He claimed to have found proof of something that could blow the lid off the entire system. He didn't go into details in the email, but it was enough to send up red flags. The next day, Preston disappeared. I searched everywhere. His home, his office, even the places he frequented around town. There was no sign of him, no trail to follow. It was as if he had been erased. My superiors were furious. They blamed me for letting him slip through the cracks, for not neutralizing the threat sooner. I knew what was coming. I'd seen it happen before. When someone in my position failed, they didn't get a second chance. But I wasn't going to go down that easily. I started digging through Preston's files, searching for any clue about where he might have gone or what he was planning. And that's when I found it, the real manuscript. The one he hadn't published. The one that had been hidden in plain sight. It was a detailed account of the last 50 years of global history, filled with names, dates, operations I'd been involved in. It wasn't fiction, it was the truth. The kind of truth that could unravel everything. Preston had somehow stumbled onto classified files, the kind of files that should have been locked away in vaults deep underground. He knew about the operations I had erased from history, the ones I'd made sure never saw the light of day. He knew about me. Now I'm sitting here in this motel room waiting for the inevitable knock on the door. I don't know if Preston is still out there, somewhere in the shadows, or if they've already found him. But I do know this. He was right. Everything we believe, everything we know, it's all been shaped, molded, controlled by people like me. And I'm done with it. This is my confession. The truth, buried in the noise of the world. Maybe no one will ever read this. Maybe it'll just fade away, like so many other stories I've buried. But if you're reading this, know that the truth is out there, and sometimes it's the last thing you ever want to find. Well, here you are at the end, or is it just the beginning? If these stories didn't send chills down your spine, don't worry. There's plenty more where they came from. I've got a whole archive of unsettling tales just waiting to keep you up at night. So do yourself a favor, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. Think of it as your lifeline, because in the world of the unknown, being prepared is half the battle. Who knows what's lurking around the corner in the next video? Until then, stay curious. And maybe leave a light on.